I just wanted, and it is being recorded. So I want to just kind of take this moment to welcome people from near and far, and Carrie and I and Anisha and all of us are excited to learn where you're from. So again, if you're just joining us, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, why you're interested in women entrepreneurship. And if you have a website or some kind of social media, drop it in. A little bit about me. Carrie said that, I'm in the Human Rights and Equity Office as an advisor. I'm also a woman living with a disability. In a past life, I was also a woman entrepreneur in a very male-dominated industry. So it's going to be interesting to have some conversation later. But first, and before other business, I would just like to take a moment to acknowledge the land that I happen to be situated on, and I'm not too far from Queens, even though I'm working from home. And I would like all of you, wherever you are, to take a moment to think about the Indigenous land that you are on right this minute. In Queens, we have a thing, or not a thing, but in the land acknowledgement for people that are settlers, to distinguish between welcome and acknowledgement, because I am not Indigenous. So I'd like to welcome all of you here today, and Queens and Weekend, and even me about half an hour north of Queens. We're all situated on Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe territory. And I hope all of you are grateful to be able to learn today and live on these lands and play, and know that we are uninvited guests. But as treaty people in Canada, we all have a responsibility to really take a moment and be intentional about land acknowledgements. I don't know about you all, but I find that land acknowledgements is something that people kind of read off a page, and then we go on to like what we're doing. So it would be interesting, because I know we have folks from all over the place, and interestingly, a large contingent from upper state New York. So I'd be interested in the chat, and I see the chat's blowing up here, to learn a little bit about how folks, not settler folks, kind of think about land acknowledgement and the responsibilities we have to learn the truth before we can really reconcile with our Indigenous peoples. And next, I would like to say thanks to WeCan for hosting, and WeCan's affiliated with Queen's University here in Kingston. And the work couldn't be possible without the generous support of the Federal Economic Development Ontario and the Women's Entrepreneurship Strategy Ecosystem Fund. That was a long thank you, but it couldn't be possible without the funds and the support of our granting agencies. And Carrie and I have been talking about how this is super great. And also, Q, talking to you now, Q Lethbridge is our ASL interpreter for this event, and her pronouns are she, her. And she's the only ASL interpreter right now, so she needs to take a break somewhere around 10:50, 11, and we're talking to Anisha about that. And so, Anisha, like, do your thing, but definitely a hard stop at 10:50. And I think maybe we might all need that, like just to stretch and like, have a bio break and all that kind of stuff. So, drum roll, please. Now it's my great honor to introduce our guest, Anisha Phillips, and she is a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant with Feminuity in Toronto. And for folks that know me, like, I trip over words, and so I looked it up last night on their website, and Feminuity is a want to say mashup, even though I'm too old to say mashup, between feminism and ingenuity. So think about that for a minute, like her organization, feminism and ingenuity. So femininity in Toronto. She's going to introduce herself way more beautifully than I can. Sorry. But she does hold a Bachelor of Arts and Honors at Queen's in Gender Studies, yay, and then a Master's at U of T in Women and Gender Studies. And so I would like to, with an honor in my heart, pass it over to you, Anisha.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you so much, Heidi, for that wonderful introduction. I really appreciate those kind words and spending some time with a land acknowledgement for where you are located. I'm going to spend some time acknowledging and reflecting on the land that I am also on today before I engage in the content. So I'm currently on land that is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. What is now known today as Toronto is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. So Heidi eloquently outlined some of the importance of land acknowledgements and practices that Indigenous folks are begin asking of us. I believe that land acknowledgements are really a necessary first step in honoring the original occupants of a place, right? They also help us to recognize and respect Indigenous people's inherent kinship beliefs when it comes to the land, especially since those beliefs were restricted for so long. So I conduct this land acknowledgement in the spirit of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. And as a settler participating in diversity, equity, and inclusion work, my ability to do this work is indebted to the historical and the ongoing resistance and advocacy of Indigenous peoples. So I begin this workshop by asking us to reflect on the history and the contemporary injustices as we go through our workshop together. I am also going to share a link in the chat to a video that I really enjoy from some Indigenous folks engaging with the conversation about the importance of land acknowledgements. But I also know that land acknowledgements, they allow us to reflect on a singular physical space and the land that it sits on. But with remote workshops and engagements, we're in this virtual space. And as such, what I like to do is share the work of an Indigenous thinker, creator, somebody that has provided some contributions that I want to highlight. So today I have the privilege of highlighting the work of Gwen Benaway. So Gwen is a trans woman of Anishinaabe and Métis descent. She is a poet. She is a PhD candidate at the Women and Gender Studies Institute at the University of Toronto. Gwen also happens to be one of my great friends. So I'm very lucky to be able to highlight the work of Gwen today. Gwen is also the recipient of the Governor General's Literacy Award for her third collection called Holy Wild. That's actually pictured here, which explores the intersection of Indigenous and transgender identities. So I'm going to also share a link to Gwen reading from their book of poetry, Holy Wild. Oops, sorry, that's not right. Yeah, I really recommend if poetry is something that you're interested in to check that out. Beautiful. So Heidi did a wonderful job introducing me, so I'm really grateful for that. But yes, my name is Anisha Phillips. My pronouns are she and her. I am a diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant and specialist. So I currently am holding a consultant position with Feminuity. I have for some time now. Feminuity is a diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting firm. With Feminuity, I do a variety of things. A lot of it is education and training with a variety of businesses, but I am also a qualitative researcher. So I spend a lot of time talking to businesses and to employees and people there about their experiences working at their companies and learning about how to scale diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts across the business, but also how to make things better for more people. So a lot of the conversation that we'll be engaging with today through this workshop comes out of a lot of reflection that I've had from talking to employees. And then another thing before I get into content is I wanted to just set the stage with a bit of a working agreement for our time together, just to set some expectations and also to like regulate this space a little bit. So the first thing I want to remind us all is just to check in with yourself through this process. So, and through this workshop, some parts may feel a little bit too fast for you. Some may feel a little too slow. We're really all at these very different stages of our learning journey and our understanding with this work. And so this just might require some patience of us at certain times, but just remembering the objective is to bring everyone along together. The next point here is just to stop, rewind, and change your mind. So if you say something and then, or, engage in the chat and then later disagree with yourself, that's completely okay. And I really welcome you to offer something in its replacement in real time. The next thing is when sharing stories, I encourage you to try to include the personal and the systemic parts. So that could sound like I failed because I didn't reach out for help and because past discrimination made me worry to do so, right? So it's that personal kind of about something that you had the ability to do, but also like the systemic, right? Discrimination can be systemic. The next point here is just to share the airtime. So if you're someone who participates often and is really comfortable doing so, that's great, do it, love it, but also just remaining aware of other people's participation. I will also be utilizing a platform called Mentimeter. It's an anonymous submission platform where you can share some thoughts and anonymous questions at the end, and that helps with this as well. The next point is just to apologize if you mess up. I think that we're all going to make mistakes on our social justice journey as part of the process. I think that if we're engaging in this work meaningfully and intentionally, we're going to mess up. That's just what happens when we're trying. So it's just learning how to hold yourself accountable to that. And then the last thing is when there's time to ask questions, please ask them. I find that one of the biggest blockers to advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts is when, folks have questions or are uncertain about things. And instead of, asking, they kind of hold it in and make assumptions or let things fester. So I really encourage you to ask questions. You can put them in the chat. You can share them on Mentimeter. You can unmute yourself if there's a pause. I welcome all forms. Great. So let's get into the content now. So I know kind of in my work and in some research I've been doing, if this transition to remote work, that resources to better remote working practices are now widely available. Right? But with this, I wanted to take a really different approach, right? And ask, how can we ensure that remote working is equitable and inclusive? How can we emphasize with and design for each person's unique situation, challenges, and their concerns, given the multiplicity of individual circumstances brought about and exacerbated by the current pandemic that we are in? We know that equity and inclusion challenges they already exist in non-remote working, right? And this can be exacerbated or show up in new and different ways within this virtual context. So I've structured our conversation today in 4 key areas. So that's going to be virtual office norms. So some just like things that we can start to improve on within our norms and day-to-day. Virtual meetings and ways that we can make our virtual meetings more inclusive. Virtual presentations. So that means like some content about what it means to create our materials. And then virtual engagement. So ways that we engage and some strategies for fostering belonging. And then from there, with some time, we will be engaging in some scenarios to try to put this all to practice. It's really up to you in the degrees that you want to share there. And then just a few other things to mention is that if you feel comfortable, please share your pronouns in your Zoom name. That's just if you're comfortable, there's no obligation to do this. Just I want to make sure that we are referring to people in the most respectful manner. And then also, I just want to again reiterate that our ASL interpreter is here for your use, and I will also be using closed captioning at the top of the screen. Beautiful. So now that I've talked for a little bit, I kind of want to turn it to you again. So I'm just curious if we could spend a few moments and just what are some challenges that you or your team have started to face in transitioning to remote work? So what are some challenges, maybe what are some barriers? You can feel free to share in the chat. I have shared the Mentimeter link, so you can feel free to open that up and it'll prompt you to share something, and it'll auto-populate here, and I'll read them. Or you can unmute yourself, whatever is best for you. Great. So our first thought is children being at home and interrupting. Yep. That's a very common experience, and I'll definitely be diving into that a little bit. So someone else mentioned feeling emotionally connected with team members. Yeah, that's definitely a really valid experience. I feel like this distance between the screen can create emotional barriers too. So yeah, hopefully some of the suggestions that we outline can help with that. So feelings of isolation and lack of motivation. I get energy from others in the office, and this is a huge gap at the moment for me. Yeah, I definitely feel that. I am a social person. So yeah, like this isolation with just having that screen in front of you is really lonely. That's something a lot of folks are experiencing, and we'll definitely be talking about that. Awesome. Someone said I worked from home before, so this started. So welcome to everyone else. Yeah, like here we go. Get on board. Someone shared a lack of consistent communication as we can't stop by at office or pick up the phone for quick answers. Yeah, this is definitely something that a lot of clients share with me as well. Yeah, we'll definitely be talking about maybe some little strategies to help with that. Someone said I've been struggling with getting a hold of my team when I need help. We have instant messaging system Slack, but it just seems like no one's ever available. Sometimes I wait hours for a response, and sometimes I never get one. Right. And when you have someone in person that you can just grab and ask a question, right, that we don't have that instant demand with remote work, right? We don't have that instant availability. So how do we shift and adjust and actually get people to respond? So that's a great thought, and we'll be talking about that. A loss to work, having to reconstruct the business to provide e-learning coming soon. So whoever said that, they got e-learning coming soon. So that's a great pitch. Yeah, we definitely experienced that in Feminuity as well. Learning how to provide content such as this, even in a virtual format, and how do we educate in this new world. A lack of constant communication as we can't stop by, pick up the phone for quick answers. Internet outages. Yeah, and if we understand like kind of a global context, we know that a lot of folks or my clients especially have people working globally, and if they're using something like Zoom, which may not have a VPN, right, they may not be able to access it in countries like Cuba, for example. Being able to learn from each other through osmosis and hearing each other's questions. Yeah, just like we call it, like sometimes just decisions happen at the water cooler, right? And how do we create communication that makes more sense and can be accessible? And then the last one here is just an expectation of always being available for work activities. So that's a great one. I will definitely be talking about that because I experience it too, for sure. Beautiful. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating in that. And I think it really sets the stage for some of these conversations we're going to dive into now. So, this first section we're going to talk about is virtual office norms. So, all workplaces, they have these implicit and explicit norms, right? We call them like the rules of the game, whether that's offline or online. We can all really play a role in setting remote working culture in tune with our team members' experiences and their needs. And so, with all these challenges and considerations in mind, I want to work to minimize the difficulties of this transition and give you some useful best practices as you continue to build a culture of belonging in your remote work environment. So, remote work engagements will likely be increasingly common even after COVID-19 and the pandemic. So we want to make sure that we're really stepping into this reality in the most mindful and inclusive way possible. So, for example, Twitter and Square and many, many more who have followed along announced that workers now work from home indefinitely, depending on what they want and what makes sense, the most sense for them. So it's definitely something that's become an increasing push here. So the first kind of subcategory I want to dive into is just setting expectations. So although this can kind of feel to some like a just like a given, I think setting expectations around communication, collaboration, and productivity are increasingly important for minimizing conflict and confusion. So it's really important to consider that for those transitioning to remote work, there could be some discomfort with the significant increase in screen time. So in the virtual work environment, it might also sometimes be more and more important to repeat yourself or engage in what we call redundant communications. So a few questions, right? When you're setting expectations for your team, you can consider asking, do you expect to communicate or provide feedback to each of your direct reports daily or weekly? Are impromptu telephone calls acceptable, right? Can you just pick up the phone and call your coworker whenever you want? What are the expected email and chat response times? Right, that really gets at what someone shared in the Mentimeter, right? Is that can we set a standard and expectation for how long you should get back to a team member? Do you have solutions for technical difficulties during a virtual meeting? So we really want to be intentionally communicating the answers to these expectations to your teams. So our next area here is setting boundaries. So this is also what someone mentioned in the Mentimeter. So remote team members are often find it more difficult to unplug than office team members, which we know can lead to stress, overworking, and burnout. So a large number of workers have told me that they reported that they feel they need to be constantly available, such as being expected to respond to electronic and telephone messages immediately and be available at all times and be responsive after work. But the shift to remote work has coincided with this rise of this always on workplace culture that causes a lot of work and personal life interferences. So, really having defined schedules will enable team members to have clear expectations of when they need to be available for work. So, in the weeks immediately after COVID-19 began, the Hudson Bay Review found that only half of employees were able to maintain a 10-hour workday or less, whereas nearly 80% had been able to do so previously. So this is definitely reflective of my current conversations with employees at various companies, is that there's just this intense culture of overwork and ability to shut it off. So just being mindful that their expectations and their experiences might be different than their other work schedules when they were in office. So creating a team schedule that clearly articulates when each team member is available for work-related matters is really important. And when you do need to shift to so-called normal working hours, just practice sending a message before an impromptu phone call, just so not to interrupt workflow or concentration. And I just really want to step back here and, reflect that, hey, now's the time to trust and empower our employees, right? Trust is essential. And some managers might feel the impulse to micromanage in the absence of a face-to-face contact. But this can lower employee motivation and compromise productivity. So we like to say, instead of checking up, try checking in. So instead of surveillance, focus on giving employees the tools and support that they need to succeed. And in the chance to communicate, any difficulties that they're encountering in achieving their goals. So people are finding really diverse ways to manage their new work and home lives. And if the job is still getting done, the journey and methods are less important. So our next section here is about providing tools and resources. And if there is any questions, feel free to interrupt me at any time. It's okay. So not all team members are going to have equal and equitable tools and resources to work from home, right? We also can't assume that everyone is familiar with the latest technology and tools. So consider providing a technology stipend so team members could purchase materials and tools they need. So this is something that you can budget and afford. So for example, Shopify is a great example of this. So they provide employees with $1,000 to set up a home office. Obviously, we aren't all Shopify, but this might also require being creative with our budgets to provide some support. The next reminder here is just could have your IT team or someone on your team who's relatively good at IT to check in with people on their equipment and their cybersecurity needs. And remember that especially people with disabilities might need attention in ensuring that their home and their virtual office environment is inclusive of their specific needs and accommodations that they might have had in their office, right, in person. So remote work options for people with disabilities and those who are immunocompromised should be extended indefinitely if that is their preferred mode of working to make sure more accessible and safe environments, especially given the fact that times have proven that productivity is still attainable in these work environments. So you can also consider subsidizing home internet services, loaning equipment. That could be like things like laptops, webcams, whatever someone may need. And another point here that's a little bit different, but if you previously provide team members with food, beverages, or snacks, you should also consider trying to find ways to continue this support to support their food security. So for example, Build Out is continuing to offer a daily lunch credit of $12.50 to team members who may have counted on in-office lunches. So also, like if you are using any preferred vendors for food, just trying to support some small businesses or businesses owned by marginalized folks. I have a quote on this that I would like to read to you all now. So this quote is by a friend, a Feminuity friend of myself, and the diversity and belonging lead at Shopify. And so Prasanna says, as a person with a disability, so I'm legally blind, when we first went fully remote, I was scared about being unable to do my job, show impact, or support my colleagues, as my accommodations would not be in place. To have these worries on top of our collective fears in this new global reality felt especially daunting. I have had the support of my lead, our disability specialist and wellness team at Shopify, to help me get a virtual workplace accessibility assessment and the required accommodations in place in my home. But I recognize I am privileged. I work from an organization committed to accessibility with the resources to act on this commitment. I know that in the current context, not everyone enjoys the same experience. So that's from Prasanna. I think this quote really helps us reflect on the importance of these accommodations and making sure that these things are in place. Okay, and then our next point here, it was reflected in the Mentimeter as well. So it's just to normalize caregiving and caretaking. So caregiving is often only associated with childcare, and so it definitely does happen with childcare, but it's important to expand an understanding of caregiving to include family members of advanced ages, non-immediate family members, partners, and many more. So for many team members with caregiving roles, the responsibilities are likely increased with more time at home. So it's really important to normalize caregiving expectations among your teams while they're working virtually. So you can try hosting a discussion with your team about new norms and how children, family, pets, and many more may unintentionally interrupt calls. Let them know that, hey, this is okay. And maybe consider picking a time when they could briefly introduce them. I know that it's always welcomed. Ask team members what they need and have open and honest conversations about these needs. So, for example, if an individual requires time to care for a parent, could you ensure that the rest of the team adapts to the schedule? So, for example, during COVID-19, Basecamp CEO Jason Fried announced that employees with caregiving responsibilities, so such as kids or other obligations, were free to set their own schedules and make sure that their schedules are more flexible, even if it meant working less. Great. And our last point on this section is just to prioritize health, safety, and wellness. So, when working in remote teams, it may be harder to notice when a team member is struggling with mental health, wellness, and maybe domestic violence. So, just some tips on this is just to get clear on how to watch for signals of or respond to disclosures of domestic violence. The Dandelion Initiative has provided a great resource for talking about domestic violence. So I'm just going to share that in the chat. And I have a few other resources that may be helpful that I will also share in the chat. And we also see some organizations partnering with a wellness app such as Headspace to offer mindfulness and meditation resources to employees. So that's also really important. And then I also wanted to just mention that I think with a lot of social media movements around weight loss or weight gain or like a quarantine bod, these conversations can be really triggering for those who suffer from eating disorders or those who deal with size related stigma because of their body type. So instead, just trying to focus on the positives around creating ways that you might be moving or feeling good in bodies or experimenting with new and healthy recipes, right? Just trying to be more open, inclusive, and in those ways. Beautiful. So I'm now going to go to our next section, which is about virtual meetings. So when moving from in-person work structures to virtual ones, accessibility and inclusion within communication formats need to be addressed and adjusted. So no matter what the nature of the meeting or the duration of it, there are some really key ways to make meetings more accessible and inclusive. So our first key area here is to turn on video whenever possible. So it's definitely not mandatory, but just when possible. So turning on video helps with nonverbal cues, such as when someone raises their hand, unmutes themselves, or attempts to speak. This can also have a variety of benefits, such as combating isolation, providing a sense of community, and lip reading for those who may need it. So on any of the video conferencing platforms, such as Google Hangout or Zoom, if you need it, just consider displaying people in gallery view so you could engage with everyone equally, not just the person who may be speaking or participating. Also, trying to set the camera at eye level when keeping your webcam far enough away to show your hands and torso. So this makes conversation feel more open and inclusive. And then if the bandwidth is impacted by group video calling, just consider using videos for calls of 10 people or fewer and having only the persons speaking or participating turn their camera on. Great. And then our next section here I want to talk about is, hey, we know that video conferencing fatigue is super real. And while video is a really great way to eliminate confusion, right, promote community and make communication more straightforward, it has also been found to drain energy at times, right? There's not this one size fits all approach to expectations around video calling, right? The thing is, video can be a reminder of what we've lost during COVID-19 and social distancing, right? It can be anxiety inducing to be made more aware of everyone potentially watching you. Delays can make people appear less friendly or coherent, and silences can be mistaken for technical difficulties. And socialization may feel less organic and maybe more of an obligation rather than relaxation. So on this, just you can encourage the use of video while also acknowledging its overuse as a driver of exhaustion on the team. Schedule video calls when they're necessary and consider other means of communication such as cloud sharing files, Slack, email communications that don't really require a video chat. And consider allowing employees to share their preferred mode of communication for receiving feedback. Okay. And then our next thing here that I want to highlight is about virtual housekeeping. So it's really important to have a rotating system to ensure that tasks are shared equitably across your team. So whether it's note taking, facilitating the agenda, turning on closed captioning, the thing is, we know, and this is something I hear a lot from employees at various businesses, is that women and racialized folks often end up taking more during note taking and extra tasks than others. So like this virtual housekeeping and this housekeeping in meetings. So at the beginning of each meeting, just making sure to establish who's going to be responsible for taking notes, facilitating the agenda, and after the meeting where they're going to be posted afterwards. You can also consider doing things like recording a meeting so that it can be available after, or using a platform that can create a transcript, such as like a software called Trint that generates transcripts from audio and video files. So for example, at Feminuity, when we have a team call in the morning, we create a transcript of all of our team meetings. It's not just because it creates this transcript that we can refer back to, but also it's an accessibility thing that we want to be doing in our best practice. Great. And then I'm just going to cover a few others before our break. So the next thing here is just to share pronouns and get names right. So it's really important to remember that pronouns are one way that we express gender and how others perceive our gender. We can't always know someone's pronouns just by looking at them, and it is very harmful to make that assumption. And sharing pronouns helps alleviate misgendering and normalizing sharing our gender identities. So when having virtual meetings with our team members across the organization, just share your pronouns when doing introductions if you're comfortable, and ask others to do the same if they are comfortable. Try adding your pronouns to your screen names on your video calls. And we can also understand that in this virtual context, it's also really important that we get names right. So names are another way that we identify ourselves. And we know that a lot of folks have experiences where their names may be mispronounced or misunderstood. So it's really important to start to practice getting names right and if we verbalize them. So I'm going to share a few resources. So one, Feminuity, we use something called Name Drop. So Name Drop is essentially a service where you can record yourself verbally saying your name and provide it anywhere that you may want. So we hyperlink it in our email signature, and that puts the onus on some other people to engage with it and get it right. I also, know that in this instance, the onus is on you to kind of make that recording of your name, but understand that if someone has offered that to you, to practice, share it, and get it right. I'm also sharing a link to a blog that I wrote a while back about some tactical ways to show respect for names. I did a series of 4 blogs on names and the importance of names, which never thought that names had this much going on with them, but it definitely does. So I've shared that there as well. Great. And then I also wanted to remind us that the importance of sharing updates. So research shows that at the beginning of meetings with like a non-working group activity or discussion, it actually improves performance on virtual group tasks. So before diving into work-related discussions, just giving an opportunity to share updates. So that could be just 10 minutes, sharing weekend plans, just any conversations that naturally occur. You could provide a prompt. So in our team, we do a one-word check-in. I personally have trouble describing my feelings in one word. I got a lot of feelings going on. But there is other formats like sharing a GIF or just putting more words to it. And then the last thing I want to mention before taking a break is just the importance of prioritizing one-on-ones. So if you are a manager, you may already hold one-on-ones, but with remote teams, I just want to emphasize it's more important than ever before. So this is an important part of checking in on your workplace and making sure that they feel valued and heard despite the distance. So blocking off some designated time in your calendar and schedule one-on-ones with your direct reports on a weekly or bi-weekly basis. And if you're not a manager, challenge yourself to take up offers to speak with your managers or members of leadership as often as possible. It can feel uncomfortable because it can be quite intimidating to ask for that. You don't want to feel like you're demanding their time, but it's a really important strategy to encourage yourself to do that, as it can foster connection and understanding about things that are happening in the workplace. So that's just a little bit to get us started for the first half. So we're going to take a 10-minute break now, and then we will come back and talk about virtual presentations and virtual engagement, our last two sections. Beautiful. So welcome back, everyone. Thank you for coming back if you've been able to. I have lots more I want to cover with you on the next half an hour. So I'm going to try to do it as efficiently while also speaking slow for time for everyone to take in the information. So our next section is about virtual presentations, and I think that diving into this topic is important because whether we are facilitating a workshop, whether we're pitching to an investor or presenting to a client, there's some really key ways that we can make presentations more accessible and more inclusive. This is definitely by no means all of the things, but at a high level, here are some important ones. So the first kind of bucket I want to cover here is about our presentation materials. So the first one is about keeping slides simple. So we want to consider how much time our audience may need to take in and understand our slides. So using keywords or short phrases, maybe instead of full sentences when possible. We also understand here that slides can be a useful way to take away information if they don't have like a script. So just understanding that you might need to have a dual purpose. We also want to remember to make visuals large and visible for those who can see them. So text and visuals large can help people take in information. This also includes less important information like graphs, image captions, footnotes, URLs, references. Some things on text to note is that sans serif fonts like Arial, for example, or Open Sans, they're great and most accessible. Just being generous with our spacing, so between words, lines, and letters. Using bold for emphasis instead of underlines or italics, those are less identifiable. Remembering to use mixed caps, not all caps, so mixed caps or camel case. Those are more accessible. And then keeping web links on your slides short, so consider using a URL shortener. On this, I also want to remind us to avoid using unnecessary slide transitions. I remember when like PowerPoint first became like a thing, and people were using all these fancy like slide transitions and things like that. But we know that slide transitions can make members of our audience feel sick or distracted, and transitions and animations, they can trigger nausea, headaches, dizziness for some, particularly those with with inner ear disorders. Also in presentation materials, I want to remind us to caption and describe media. So if it's a video, when we're playing the video, introducing or summarizing the video to add context or explain what's occurred. If it's an audio clip and it does not have a visual component, displaying the equivalent text while the audio is playing. And when using images, just making sure that we caption and describe the pictures. On this, I also want to mention, just to avoid using phrases like "as you can see here," right? That again just assumes the abilities of everyone. Another point here is just checking color contrast on our slides. So color contrast values help make text more visible. There are some specific resources to help determine sufficient contrast. I am sharing one of such in the chat. And then we also want to ensure representation in stock photos. So if we're, I think if we do like a simple Google search about like group of people, algorithms, Google, it's biased. It's made by people who have bias. So, trying to be really intentional about seeking that information. So I'm also sharing a link to a website that has some great images. And then the last one on this is just about closed captioning. So if possible, using a platform that has a captioning feature especially if you can't budget for an ASL interpreter. So using video conferencing such as Zoom Room specifically or Microsoft Teams, they both offer captioning in multiple languages, or as we mentioned, presenting with Google Slides like I am doing now and turning on the captioning feature. So you can also, if you are using something that doesn't have the feature, kind of like Carrie mentioned at the break, consider using a captioning service or having a person provide captions in real time. And I think like what I want to mention on this stuff, and as well as some of the other content we've covered today, is what we call the curb cut effect that some of us might be familiar with, which basically talks about when curb cuts were developed in a sidewalk, right? It was because it was intentionally made for people who use wheelchairs, right? But we understand that once that was made, it benefited those who use a stroller or have strollers for children. It benefited those of advanced age from stepping over a harsh curb, right? When we put in intentional measures to be more welcoming of people of all different abilities, it does actually end up benefiting more people than just what we intended it to do. So for example, captioning is one of such, where it not only helps folks for accessibility measures, but also like it helps a lot of people who may have some challenges keeping up, paying attention, right? I talk to so many people who may not have disclosed that they require them, but find it very beneficial. And then my next area here is about context. So just remembering to use plain language when possible, even if it's with your team that you think everyone can understand more complicated terminology, just reminding to use plain language because we don't know where people are at. And using gender neutral terms. So when referring to a group of people, a really common tendency is to say, you guys are those guys. And if we're engaging in conversations of inclusive language, is something that people have probably talked about. It has two implications, right? Saying you guys or verbalizing or participating and engaging with that term. It assumes that men is the neutral to which everyone is compared against. But it also has another implication. It can potentially misgender some folks. So I had a situation that I was in a room with one of my friends, and who was trans, and someone kept saying "you guys," and she had to be that person to put up her hand and say, "Hey, listen, I know you don't mean anything by this, but I have worked so hard to get people to validate who I am and use my pronouns of she and her. And when you say you guys, it is triggering for me, and it misgenders me." And in that moment, she had to be the person to say and bring it up and do the whole thing. But to me, that was a moment where I was like, it clicked. I was like, this is so much bigger than just reinforcing men as the dominant. So you can use terms like people, folks, y'all, teammates, or just any terms that don't imply a gender. Also, instead of consider using things like people of all genders or all genders instead of like opposite genders, both genders, or consider using terms like parenting instead of mothering and fathering. And the last point on this is just to check in on tech related needs. So survey people in advance of a presentation to assess any needs that they may have. And when presenting content, check in with participants to determine if they're experiencing any tech related challenges or barriers. And then on presentation style, I just want to remind us all to pause between topics. So just giving people time to process information just allows time for response legs and for contributions. And then if you're presenting to a larger group, try having a host like we do, right? Having a dedicated host to support with any issues that participants may be having. The host can also monitor and facilitate any questions or answers. And participants can also ask hosts anonymous questions. And then the last thing is just to try out headphones. So test the sound levels and quality before a presentation and trying out headphones or a USB microphone if you're verbally participating or speaking. So I'm going to share another resource that I have from Feminuity in the chat. I'm going to try. So basically, this is a guide that we created in partnership with the Talent Bureau, which is like a speaking, a communications company, and Awaken, which is another DEI consultant firm. And it talks about some of these tips for inclusive and accessible virtual presentations. Great. And then our last like bucket of conversation here is about virtual engagement. So we know that loneliness is a real concern for remote team members. And so in order to combat social isolation, we want to start encouraging experiences of team bonding. So some tips for fostering team bonding and belonging is to set up a system for virtual water coolers. So this could be like a 15 to 30-minute window for colleagues to connect and talk about nothing in particular. These moments really help develop rapport and build a sense of belonging among team members that you might not always work directly with. And sometimes, hey, it could be a conversation with team members who do know each other well and just want to chat. I find this is something that we would do naturally in a physical work environment. So really, setting up an intentional space for this. Also setting up a system for weekly wins. So this is where all team members can hop on a video call, or it could be at the end of a all hand check-in, and take turns recognizing each other's accomplishments, no matter how small, right? It can seem kind of forced or intentional, but really when we're in this space of disconnect, it makes a huge difference to just outright acknowledge things big or small. We also have another tip here is just get everyone to make their own wild card. So this is basically an internal shared document where team members can share fun and random facts about themselves. They could really just share anything at all they find interesting. I think on my wild card, I have pictures of like my dog and funny pictures when I was a kid, right? Just again, gets people to know each other better. And then another thing I want to mention here is just talk about critical events in the world, right? Or communicate about them. We can't pretend that things like Black Lives Matter and our current climate don't affect the workplace. They absolutely do. And, the news impacts everyone's lives differently. So being bold enough to facilitate these conversations in our workplace is absolutely, I would argue, necessary at this time. And remembering that strong relationships are still a key element for long-term effectiveness and cohesion. So you want to create these opportunities to connect as to not let these relationships fall to the wayside in our remote environment. And then I also want to note that trust and vulnerability are also really essential tools in advancing DEI initiatives at your company. With marginalized employees will feel more comfortable sharing their struggles, and teams will be more apt to have these brave conversations if they have strong rapport. So making sure that, this is something that we're continuing and putting an emphasis on. Next point here is just to acknowledge your team. So recognition for meaningful work goes a long way, right? This simple act greatly boosts feelings of belonging and engagement in the workplace. So public acknowledge when a team member does an exceptional job, whether during a team meeting or over a virtual chat system such as Slack. And hey, don't forget to celebrate milestones such as birthdays if they celebrate them, or work anniversaries, right? This is really important. Um, so someone also mentioned that, some people don't want extra virtual interaction in the chat. I just noticed that, and that was actually like a point that I had, is that these are all should be optional, making sure that folks can opt into this engagement. Definitely don't need to participate on a mandatory basis at all. Perfect. And then another thing about virtual co-working. So this can be an optional call where some people who may be extroverts will benefit from working alongside other team members. So this could just be like an open call where folks can opt in and just kind of co-work there in this space and have the camera, if not, or something on, so they can opt into this focused work environment. When I'm working on a project with a coworker, will often just, even if it's on my phone, just leave it open. It just creates this like you're at a table together. And then inclusive team communications is our last section on this. So we know that the casual environment of a platform like WhatsApp, for example, or Slack might make it easy to forget that it's still a professional setting. So we can really take some purposeful steps to educate our teams on how to use your chosen communication platforms in the best way, and develop some codes of conduct to ensure these virtual spaces can try to remain free from harassment and discrimination. So I think it's really important to just lay out some standards. So for example, sometimes using GIFs or certain slang terms can perpetuate stereotypes against marginalized groups. So for example, using a Black woman GIF to describe being sassy isn't always the best option. It does have a variety of implications. I'm going to share a blog that I wrote in the chat about Black vernacular English, as well as using Black people as GIFs, does have some serious implications of, limiting representation. So that's the last section on this. And what I would like to do now is, unfortunately, we're not going to have time for scenarios today, but I'm going to send them along to Hadi and to Carrie for you all to check out. But I wanted to end with two things before some Q&A time. Is the first, I want to read this quote by Andrew Gurza, who's also a friend of Feminuity and a disability awareness consultant. So Andrew says, remote working models prove that all work can be made accessible to everyone. And they prove that disabled people can be productive even if they're not in an office. Leaders should strive to make remote work the norm from now on for disabled and immunocompromised individuals without question. Also, leaders should work closely with disabled team members during the creation of remote work strategies, because disabled people are and have always been experts in this particular area. So I just think that this quote really rounded up some of the things that I have been talking about today, and just kind of bringing together the importance of, hey, like there are some really intentional things that we can do to make things more inclusive, but these things should be happening all the time, during remote work, not during remote work. If anything, COVID-19, the pandemic have showed the power of accessibility and the need for it for everyone's lives. I wanted to highlight that Feminuity has created a resource kind of inspired by this workshop and similar workshops about fostering belonging through inclusive and accessible remote working practices. So it is available in a resource format. And I'm going to share the PDF in the chat, and again with Carrie and Heidi. But what I also want to mention on this is that this was created by someone, and I do believe it is not accessible by a screen reader. So I just wanted to call that out, let you know that if you would like a copy of this that can be detected by a screen reader, please, I'm going to be sharing my email. Just please email me, and I would love to make that accessible, available for you. So I'm going to have some time for a Q&A. If anyone, I know sometimes people jump off before the end. So I just also, while we go through the Q&A, just wanted to say that this is my Feminuity email. Again, I know that Carrie has my personal email as well. Either is completely fine. I would really, if you have any questions about the presentation or any thoughts about that we don't get to cover in the Q&A, like please feel free to reach out to me at any time. I obviously love having these conversations, even if it's feedback about this presentation, something that you didn't like. I would love to hear it. I really appreciate feedback, and I just love to continue these conversations with you all. So I'm going to leave a few minutes now for some time for a Q&A. So basically you have two formats. You can put Hattie or Carrie will be able to just share with me anything in the chat. I can try to answer, or you can also feel free to use the Mentimeter platform that will share any questions anonymously that you may have, or you can unmute yourself again, whatever you feel best.
Well, Anisha, thank you so much. My gosh, I'm gonna have to read the text, and it's just been so many great resources, and the chat has been blowing up, and I don't want to spend too much time. We are at 11:20. We have 10 minutes. I want to have some time at the end to thank you and Carrie and everyone else that's organized this, but people, like, go ahead and ask this wonderful resource questions, and you've been a wealth. I know I have questions, but I would rather open it up to other folks.
I've noticed just a few things in the chat that I'll highlight. So one says, can you describe the purposeful steps that can be taken by an organization to prepare users for how to use communication tools like Slack? These seem to be a big hole in preparation for all to be prepared to use a tool, and therefore creates more exclusion rather than inclusion. So that's a great point. Thank you for sharing that, Elizabeth. I think that to me, and just let me know if this has already been done, is that there needs to be training and like a specific training session on how to use a platform like Slack, as well as someone who's facilitating this presentation to dive into the various barriers or accessibility things that and measures that are available on such a platform, right? That there needs to be like a formal training for that's open to everyone, not just people who have to then go and message and be like, this isn't accessible for me in X, Y, or Z ways, or hey, I don't know how to use this, right? It just needs to be made very explicit and intentional effort, even if you just assume that everyone knows how to use it. So yeah, I think having that official training could help with that. And another question was, are we able to share the resources that you provided with your coworkers? Yes, share away. Also, Feminuity on the Feminuity website, just www.feminuity.org. It also has a resources page that we release tons of resources, probably every month. Tomorrow, just so you know, I'm actually releasing a resource that I created about inclusive holidays, observances, and celebrations. And it has some tips for how we can be more inclusive in our holiday celebrations. So that's going to be released tomorrow morning. So yes, you can definitely get that resource if you either subscribe to our the Feminuity newsletter or just visit the website sometime tomorrow. I went in. I was like, what are all the critical things we got to do? Let's go in. So that was that. Any other thoughts or questions?
This is Heidi again. Having a 25-year-old son with severe autism, thank you for thinking about the holiday seasons. It's been brutal. And we think often about, disabilities, and they come in all shapes and forms, visible and non-visible and episodic. And, I've actually gone away over the holidays, over Christmas with my son, just to avoid all that kind of, I'm going to say it, crap. QCRAP, crap. So thank you for really thinking about the whole spectrum and the diversity of disability and the barriers that exist in the environment, because barriers don't exist within our folks, or in me. I have a disability. It's the how do we move it? And you've so eloquently spoke about the social model of disability, Anisha. And we have a few minutes left. We have 5 minutes left, and there's such rich resources on the chat. And as we wrap this up, though, I just want to make sure that if everyone had an opportunity to put a question or to talk to Anisha, or ask questions of Carrie before we wrap it up for this session.
I have a question, and I don't know if there's an easy answer, but I thought I'd throw it out there and see what you have to say. Is that I work with a fabulous team of women. They're wonderful. They're all over the country, and we're all in different regions, and we're all different demographics. So we have different life experiences, and we come from different places. And I do find sometimes, and I think that Zoom or virtual meetings makes it more challenging, because sometimes I just find that even our ways of thinking are very different, depending if you've grown up with the computer as your best friend and you think in a different kind of way than people who, like me, who are from the analog era. And I just wondered if this comes up at all, how to bridge those gaps, if there are any easy tools.
Yeah, great question. And thanks for that reflection. I think that it's not an easy answer, like you mentioned. This transition isn't easy for most people, right? Understanding that I think over communicating sometimes, like I think a lot of my clients have been mentioning that, like they're feeling like, okay, there's just too much communication happening right now. My CEO is telling me too many things. But I think like that's really been helping with like, okay, this is how we're using these tools, and allows different people to share what they are stronger at, right? So some of the younger generation might feel like they're stronger at tech, and they get to now have this role of empowerment to be like, I get to now teach something cool, like one of the team tools at Feminuity. Every Friday, one of our team members has a chance to share something that is useful to them, that they kind of learned that week or that month, that we think that the team could learn about. So it kind of can help with distribution of like empowerment and power to like have people what they're more strong at, but then it also has the dual purpose of over communicating tools that other people might or people more of advanced age might not be as aware of how to use them, especially just spending time and over communicating that. I think stuff like the water cooler or like a team one-on-one chats all like as frequently as possible. I think coming from like an executive or leadership level to be like, I want you, if you want to take this opportunity, to book those calls in and be more intentional about it, because it can feel awkward or forced, but we kind of have to, right? It's like we don't have the opportunity anymore to just walk over to someone and ask about their weekend. Like we have to be more intentional. And I believe that as we continue to do it more and more, it will become our new normal. But it's going to feel weird for a bit. So those are a few things.
Thank you. Actually, that's really helpful. You gave me a great idea there. Thank you.
And on that note, I would just like, it's almost 11:30, and some questions we didn't get to around live captioning.
Yeah, of course.
And so this is not the end of a discussion with WeCan. This is not the end of a discussion around OvercomeHER. All the wonderful things that WeCan is doing with the funding that they're getting. And so the last couple of minutes, I really, this is personal for me. So I want to thank Anisha first and foremost, and being so, honest and raw and present. The word that I took away from your talk is intentional.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so thank you for that. And I want to thank Carrie, Ramsey, for everything that she's doing with WeCan, at Queens, and it can be possible without the support of Queens and WeCan and the FedDev Ontario and the Ecosystem Fund. Tons of great resources, Carrie, in the chat, and I know you're going to be sending that out. And I think I saw in the chat, like sharing, for folks who couldn't be here today. I think that's really great. And one of the things I'm going to take away is I have a tendency to say "you guys" a lot. So that's going to be my practice. There is no such thing as innocent speech, right? And so how do we replace our language that is gender inclusive? And then last thing I'm going to say before I hand it over to Anisha or Carrie for closing remarks is, and I wrote it here right now, and I don't know when I wrote it, but I wrote it and I put a box around it. Call it out.
Nice.
Thank you for letting me moderate this session. It's been a blast. And I hope that, we all look each other up on LinkedIn. And Carrie and Anisha, in no particular order.
Thank you so much, Heidi. And just before we lose Anisha, Chantel had a question about the closed captioning. I don't know if you want to put that. It's like after the show. This is like the Oprah moment you have, Anisha. For those of us who have stuck around to the very end, no, it's also being recorded.
Yeah.
Do you want to just add about the closed captioning question?
Yes. So this was in a conversation just that wasn't recorded. For those who are curious, I briefly mentioned it, but the captioning that is being used during this presentation is just done by Google Slides. So the way that Zoom works in this type of meeting is that captioning is not available. We have had conversations with Zoom about this and just haven't been able to access that in this format. However, it's just I'm presenting a Google Slides presentation, and then closed captioning feature is at the bottom here. You can change the size, where it is located, but obviously we mentioned there was a conversation about a few of the barriers with this type of captioning. It's not always accurate pronunciation, and sorry, there's you can't finish a sentence and that kind of thing. It's just one continuous flow. We also can't tell who is verbalizing certain things, so there is some barriers with it. But if you want to have something, it is there. And yeah, so that's on that.
Thank you for that. And thank you again to Q for assisting us today. We're so grateful. And I want to thank also Leah, who's taught me so much about this subject. And I'm just continuing to learn, just like many of you. So thank you for being patient, and to the whole We Can community for joining us today. I hope you have a fabulous day. Again, if you would like a copy of the recording, you can email me directly. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Q, and thanks all.